Good, well, welcome back. After the coffee break. I should introduce myself. I'm Bob White. I'm the Associate Director of the Faraday, and I'm a physical scientist. Dennis is a biological scientist, so we reckon between us we cover the whole board. And I'm chairing this session because we have Sir John Polkinghorne, who's a physicist, so that's on the physical side. And it's a great pleasure to welcome John. He's a very familiar face at our talks. He's been really kind to us, giving a lot of lectures at our previous talks, so I know we're in for a treat. Let me just tell you something about his background. He did physics at Cambridge here latterly for 25 years as a research scientist, looking at elementary particles. Was made a Fellow of the Royal Society. But decided in '79, I think it was, wasn't it, to become ordained, which he did, and then was an Anglican priest. Went back eventually to Queen's College, Cambridge, where he was president, and has therefore got a good background to speak on science and faith, because he's had one foot in each field for this last several decades. He's written several influential books. He's chaired a lot of committees. One of them I noticed was on use of genetic material, which is a very hot topic again just this week, isn't it? And some of you who live in Britain at least might have heard him on the radio last Sunday giving the morning service, the address at the morning service, which very appropriately I thought covered all three of his main strands of his life, because it was at Queen's College in the chapel there, and he talked about science and religion. And so it was a great pleasure to hear him at that morning service. So without further ado, I think I'll stop talking and introduce Sir John Polkinghorne.
Well, thank you, Bob. I'm glad to be here. Glad to have the chance of talking for a bit and then having a conversation. I wasn't able to come and hear John Brooks' lectures, unfortunately, but I'm sure that in the course of them he would have made it absolutely clear to you that there is no single and simple model for the interaction of science and faith, and that the balance and character of that discourse and dialogue has changed not only because of discoveries and understandings, but also just of historical setting. However, I think that if you were to go out there and stop a few people in the street and ask them what they thought was the relationship between science and religion, the chances are that you get a pretty high response saying that there was a battle going on between the two, where people would sign up for a conflict picture, so that either you were on the science side or you were on the religious side, and it would be sort of dishonest, really, in some senses, to try and be in the middle, which is, of course, where I actually believe myself to be. And I think the reason for that is the media, frankly. The media like confrontation, and they have given, in this country, and I think more widely, they have given absolutely undue prominence to the two extreme positions of the influence of science and the influence of religion. On the religious side, they give a lot of time to those people who are creationists, so-called, who believe that there is a sacred text which gives you essentially the answer, the ready-made answer, to all questions. Not just the theological questions, but essentially all questions. I think that's an indefensible position, to be perfectly frank. And I think it's ironically, those people, for example, who try to read Genesis 1 and 2 as a divinely dictated text kindly provided by God to save us the trouble of doing science, are in fact abusing Scripture. Because I'm very respectful of Scripture. It plays a very important role in my own life. But when you read a text, you have to ask yourself, first of all, what is it you're reading? What is the genre, so to speak? What's its purpose of the text? And Genesis 1 to 2 aren't scientific texts. They are something actually more profound, more interesting than that. They are religious texts. And the message, for example, of Genesis 1 is not the blow-by-blow account of an extraordinary six-day encounter between God and chaos, but to convey the message, 8 times repeated in that chapter, that nothing exists except through the will of God. God said, let there be. That's the ground base of Genesis 1. So if you don't read it theologically, but you read it as if it were science, you're actually, the irony is, you're actually abusing the text. So, but these people, they have a clear point of view, they are pretty vociferous in stating it, they carry with them the promise of confrontation and argument, and so the media people like them. On the other side, of course, are the scientific people, the Richard Dawkinses of this world. I'm not going to spend much time talking about Richard because Alison McGrath is going to take over that role this afternoon. I don't want at all to try and steal somebody's thunder. I think one of his best books actually is Dawkins' God, which is a very, very well written book. These people say that science is everything. Everything that is worth knowing, or indeed that is possible to know, is told us by science. And if that's the case, then of course there's no room for religion or any other form of humane investigation of the nature of reality, it seems to me. But I mean, that's extraordinarily implausible. Science has purchased its very great success by the modesty of its ambition. It doesn't try and talk about every kind of experience, it doesn't try and ask every kind of question, it limits itself in a way I'll say a bit more about in a minute. And to think that that world described by science, that lunar landscape, which contains information processing, reproducing systems, but has no people in it, well, that description of that arid world is an adequate account of reality is equally foolish. I think that those two sides, the scientific people and the creationists, deserve each other. And I would be quite prepared to lock them in a room and let them find out. But I don't think we'd learn a great deal from the encounter. I'm an Anglican, so there's the sensible place to be is in the middle. This is where we like to be. People who take these extreme imperialistic positions, saying religion is everything or science is everything, just fail to recognize that religion and science are complementary forms of rational inquiry. They differ from each other, and we need both forms of inquiry. I'm going to put the matter in a pretty... so I reject the conflict hypothesis on those narrow terms. When we think about the contrast between science and religion, I'm going to put it slightly crudely, but not, I think, misleadingly. People very often say that science is asking the question, how? What is the process by which things happen? And that seems to be essentially what science is up to. It speaks, in Aristotelian terms, it speaks of efficient causation. And the other three types of causation that Aristotle determined are high on the, or even present in some, on the scientific agenda. Religion, of course, is asking a different question. It's asking not how things are happening, but whether something is going on in what's happening. Is there a meaning and a purpose in the unfolding history of the world? And it seems to me that it's perfectly clear, A, that you don't have to choose between which question you ask, and also that if you're going to understand what's happening, you need to ask both the question how, and if you like, the question why. And it's very, very familiar to us all the time. The kettle is boiling because burning gas heats the water, for sure. The kettle's boiling because I want to make a cup of tea. Would you like to have one? That's also a possible component in the mystery of the boiling kettle. If I'm to understand that mysterious event of the boiling kettle, I need to ask and answer both those questions. Again, it seems to me that science and religion are concerned with different forms of encounter with reality. Science treats the world essentially as an it, as an object, as something that is available to us to kick around and pull apart to find out what it's made of. I was a theoretical physicist, very much a pencil and paper chap, but I would gladly admit that my subject was largely experimentally driven. That's the great secret weapon of science, that it can put things to the test. And if you don't believe what somebody tells you, in principle, and just occasionally in practice, you can repeat that and see for yourself. That's a very, very powerful way of finding out about things. But it only works for a certain aspect of reality. It only works for reality encountered in that impersonal mode. There's a whole swathe of human experience where we don't meet reality in that impersonal mode. We meet it not as an it, but as a thou, if you like. We encounter each other in that sort of way. And I believe we encounter the transpersonal reality of God in that sort of way as well. And when you move into that realm of personal experience, then testing has to give way to trusting. There's just a different way of finding out what's going on in what's happening. If I'm always sending little traps to see if you're my friend, I will thereby destroy the possibility of friendship between us, because it has to be based on a degree of mutual acceptance and mutual trust. Another contrast is, going back to what I said about experiment, science essentially deals with the repeatable. I know there are aspects of science, of course, which have to deal with given unique stories, the story of cosmic evolution, the story of biological evolution here on Earth. We can't run that story many times to see what happens. But the interpretations, the fragmentary evidence that we have about those historic stories depends very critically on the insights of experimental science, upon physics and upon genetics in those two cases. So I think it's still the case that science essentially is based upon general experience, repeatable experience. But every form of personal experience is, of course, unique. It can't be repeated. Even by ourselves, if I listen to a Mozart quartet twice, even if I play the same disc, I won't hear it at the same time, 2 times over. There is an irreducible uniqueness about personal experience. That's upsetting to some scientists, and sometimes they don't like it. But when they remember that not only physicists, but they're also persons, I think they'll see that's just inescapable. So now I've painted a picture of science concerned with certain questions, certain types of experience, religion concerned with a different question and different kinds of experience. Have I not then made them chalk and cheese? Have I not made them so distinct from each other that really they won't have anything to say to each other? I mean, science will just go its way, asking its questions, using its techniques. Religion will go its way, asking its questions, and answering its techniques. If that's the case, there won't be a dialogue between them. That's the independence model of how science and religion relate to each other. It's often framed in all sorts of ways. Science is concerned with facts, and religion is concerned with values, for example. That's a misleading dichotomy in itself. There are no interesting scientific facts that are not already interpreted facts. So in science, experiment and theory, experience and interpretation interlace each other in really quite subtle ways. So that division, I think, doesn't actually work. However, the notion of independence is a very popular stance to take by either people or organizations that don't want to totally rubbish religion. They don't want to say it's the worst thing that's ever happened in the whole history of the world, but equally they don't want to take it very seriously either. And they don't want to take its cognitive claims very seriously. It may help you to face life or death or whatever it may be, but that's just because it's a useful psychological aid. I mean, very much the independence picture of the relationship of science and religion is the one that national academies of science tend to adopt. I think the Royal Society has a statement about it, but the National Academy of Science in the United States has an explicit statement. So that's it. And I'm sure you all know that Stephen Jay Gould produced this notion, it's not exactly an original discovery of his, but of NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria, the statement that science has its domain, gets on with it, religion has its domain, if you like, that sort of thing, and gets on with it. And neither really has much influence upon the other. Well, I don't think that's right either. I mean, I think that's just contrary to experience. If it is the case, and as I believe it is the case, that science and religion or theology, which is the intellectual reflection upon religion, are truth-seeking, motivated investigations into the nature of reality, even if they are different dimensions of reality and with different kinds of motivation. If you believe that, then they will inevitably have some influence upon each other. How you answer the question how, and how you answer the question why, I mean, they're different questions, but the answers are not totally independent of each other. They have to have some consonant relationship to each other. If I say to you that my purpose is to have a cup of tea, and then I tell you the way I'm going to do that is to put the kettle in the refrigerator, you will doubt the genuineness of my statement. There has to be a consonance between the two. And it's just an observable fact that science and religion have influenced each other in the course of history. I mean, who could pretend, for example, that the theological understanding of the doctrine of creation has not been influenced, and I think in many ways actually influenced for good, by the understanding that the world's processes are evolutionary processes, that the world didn't come into being ready-made, but it is the unfolding of a creation in which creatures are allowed to be themselves and to make themselves. That has undoubtedly altered the tone of the discourse of theology in relation to questions of creation. So there is naturally an exchange between the two. Neither side answers the other side's questions. We have every reason to believe that scientific questions will receive scientifically stateable answers. They may be very difficult to find, and there are lots of interesting scientific questions that we don't know the answers to at the moment, but there's no reason to think that science in its own domain, asking its own proper questions, needs augmentation from any other rational discipline, including theology. Equally, I believe, and this is perhaps less widely recognised, theological questions have to be answered for theological reasons. It's just logically impossible that science disproves God in some tight sense. There's an influence that goes between the two, but that influence is not an influence of entailment. Theological questions also can expect to receive theologically motivated answers, but the form of these answers given on the two sides has to bear some sort of consonant relationship to each other, and that's, I think, where the domain of dialogue lies between science and religion, and why there is a very flourishing exchange going across the border. As I say, largely unnoticed, I think, by the media, who like the more thunderous noises that come from either side of the frontier. But nevertheless, I think there is a real traffic in ideas, a real mutual sort of understanding between those two forms of rational inquiry. It isn't the case that they are chalk and cheese. They both seek truth through motivated belief. It isn't the question that science has facts, as I already said, and religion has opinion. Both sides have access to both kinds of motivation. Scientific facts need to be interpreted facts. Religion can appeal to general factors about the world, the order and fruitfulness of the history of the world. It can appeal to particular acts of revelation. So I'm talking to my friends in science. One of the things that I've had the greatest difficulty in really getting across to many of them is exactly this fact that religion also is concerned with a scrupulous search for truth and a real desire to attain motivated belief. See, none of my friends in science know that religion in some sense is connected with faith, which of course is true. But they don't see faith as commitment to well-motivated belief, which is what I believe it is. They see it as some sort of irrational response where you shut your eyes, you grit your teeth, you believe 6 impossible things before breakfast because some unquestionable authority has told you that's what you've got to do. And of course they don't want to do that. They don't want to commit intellectual suicide, nor do I, I'm not sure nor do you. So what I'm always trying to show to my friends, and this is a different type of argument, which I can't go into obviously in detail, is that I have motivations for my religious beliefs, just as I have motivations for my scientific beliefs. The kinds of motivations are different. My scientific friends may not think my religious motivations are adequate, but they at least should recognize that they exist. One of the best reviews of Dawkins's best-selling book, The God Delusion, was written by a literary critic, a professor at Manchester called Terry Eagleton, who said that Dawkins writing about religion was like somebody writing a book about biology, having read or looked at the Handbook of British Birds. and his writing displays actually no engagement, no willingness to engage, I think you would be fair to say, with the very considerable truth-seeking intellectual resources that have been expended on religious thought in all sorts of traditions over very long periods of time. So, like most people who work so it isn't a question of fact versus opinion or rationality versus irrational belief. In fact, most of us who work in the science and religion area subscribe to a picture of the intellectual enterprise of both science and religion as being covered by critical realism. Critical because we don't just read things out of the world. And that's certainly true in science. You don't just stare at the world and see what's happening and it instantly explains itself to you. That's natural history, and it takes you so far, it doesn't take you into science. You have to explore the world from a point of view. You have to explore the world from a point of view that is corrigible and very likely to need to be corrected in terms of your reflection on what's going on. Realism, because in the end, though you don't obtain absolute truths about the nature of the physical world, the nature of biological process, you do obtain what you might call verisimilitudinous accounts of it. You acquire maps of what's happening, say, in a particular physical domain, which are reliable on a certain scale, though if you go outside that scale, you may find that you need to revise the map quite considerably. As, for example, when Newtonian clarity had to give way to a sort of quantum unclarity, due to the uncertainty principle. So critical realism is, I think, the best account of what science is up to and best explanation of how science has achieved its very considerable success. And I think it's applicable to religion as well. That's a very common feeling, as I say, in the community. Both are concerned with truth and motivated belief. So that's the portfolio of a sort of conventional taxonomy of how science and religion relate to each other, very much developed in very influential ways by Ian Barber. Ian produced in his Gifford lectures, I suppose 15 years ago now, this fourfold taxonomy of conflict, which I've rejected. Independence, that's the separate disciplines with nothing to say to each other picture. And then two forms of interaction, which he called actually dialogue and integration, which recognises there's some form of exchange taking place. And it's that middle ground, that interactive middle ground, which is the interesting area to think about. And it's difficult to know exactly how to characterise that middle ground, it seems to me. And I think, actually, to be perfectly fair, if you read Ian's accounts of dialogue and integration, they're not entirely and they're not transparent, because it is difficult to characterize. Dialogue is concerned with this sort of source for consonance, trying to say that, okay, here's physical cosmology, Big Bang cosmology, that sort of thing. How does that relate to an understanding that the universe is God's creation? Well, there isn't an entailment, a deductive argument going from one side to the other, but you can ask the question, is it a congruent understanding? Does it make sense to see a world starting very simple, becoming very rich and complex in the way that physical cosmology describes? Similar questions about the relationship of evolutionary biology to the doctrine of creation. I already quoted that phrase. It actually comes from Charles Kingsley, contemporary of Darwin. It's about the theological way to understand an evolving world is that it's a creation in which creatures are allowed to make themselves. That's a very positive sort of exchange between the two. That's the sort of consonance area. That's where I think most of us seek to work. But Ian also had a second category called integration, and that's an attempt to draw the style of scientific thinking and the style of theological thinking more closely together to produce, with the ultimate, presumably the ultimate purpose of producing a sort of common language in Esperanto between the two. He himself said he sometimes worked in the dialogue mode, sometimes in the integration mode, but he worked quite a lot in the integration mode, I think, because he is, I'm sure many of you know, Ian has made very considerable use of process theology, the picture of the nature of reality that stems from the thinking of Alfred North Whitehead, and which sees the fundamental category of the world as being events that have a structure to them. Each event is a two-phase thing. It has a prehensive phase in which it is aware of other events and aware of other influences acting upon it. Aware is that you can't talk about process theology without wagging your fingers all the time and putting in scare quotes, because though conventional contemporary process theologians decline to speak about being panpsychic and prefer to call themselves pan-experientialists, there is a distinctly panpsychic tinge to process thinking. So these events are influenced by other events and so on, including, of course, being influenced by Whitehead's picture of God, who is a sort of lure, standing at the edge of process, but trying to persuade and beguile process to move in a particular direction. And then there comes the concrescent phase, which is where the event takes a particular form. That's where the panpsychism becomes a little bit intense. And it's difficult to think, as I say, not to use that sort of language you're talking about. You don't think that's the way of thinking about the world. I think it's not the right way of thinking about the world. I think that actually physics, I think that process metaphysics doesn't fit very well onto actual physical process. It's not so episodic as this event-dominated thing. There's a lot of continuity in physical process, even in quantum process. So it's where the Schrödinger equation just smoothly unfolds, except at these mysterious moments of measurement. So I don't think that process thinking fits on very well to physical science thinking, and also don't think it fits on very well to theological thinking, because the God of process theology is essentially a persuader, standing at the margins of occurrence, trying to draw things in this direction. But the real decisions lie with the events themselves. I personally want a stronger view of God's relationship with creation than process theology is able to convey. I mean, to put it bluntly and straightforwardly, I don't think the God of process theology was the God who raised our Lord Jesus Christ from the dead. Or could it be? Another example, I suppose, of integration would be perhaps the synthetic thought of Tyler de Chardin, who spun a sort of evolutionary metaphysic out of his expert knowledge of evolutionary biology and anthropology. Again, I'm not myself persuaded. So when I came to write about these things, I wanted to rephrase dialogue and integration as these two options sitting there in the middle, and preferred to describe dialogue as being the search for consonants. And integration, it seems to me, was really a search for an assimilation, pulling together of science and religion. And I think that might be a wonderful thing to do. I think it is a very dangerous thing to attempt to do, and I think it almost always results in the subservience of theology to science. And I'm wary of that process. But when I began to think a bit more about these things more recently, in a book of mine called Science in the Trinity, I began to be dissatisfied with this sort of methodological or epistemological way of arguing about how science and religion relate to each other. As I say, I think most of the people will say that they're somewhere in the middle in this dialogue, integration, consonance, assimilation area, where there is some form of real influence and exchange between the two. But when you think about particular writers and particular thinkers in this field, what really characterizes their position isn't this methodological approach, which in some sense is common with different degrees, different emphases. In some sense is common to all the people all sensible people, I might say, working in this area. What is much more discriminatory, it seems to me, much more interesting to think about, is the content of what people are prepared to take into account, and in particular, the theological content, the degree of theological thinking and the degree of theological insight, and the width and scope of theological categories that people are prepared to draw into the discussion between the two. And so I concocted a four-component taxonomy of interaction, which is based not upon method, but upon theological content that is drawn into. The scientific content on the whole is going to be pretty common to everybody, but it's the theological content with which one is seeking constants, the scope of that, which it seems to me is the interesting discriminator between a number of leading and influential people who are acting in the field. That's what I want to talk about a little bit. The first category I thought about was something I labelled as deistic. And each of these categories has an exemplary figure. And the exemplary figure for the deistic position is Paul Davies, who has, of course, written a couple of books, and quite often talks about the relationship between science and religion. And he's an example of somebody who is not hostile to religion, but has a sort of cosmic religiosity, I think it might be fair to say. I mean, he writes very clearly and interestingly about science. He's very impressed with the order of the world, very impressed with the fruitful history of the universe that's turned a ball of energy into a home of saints and scientists, very impressed by the fine-tuning arguments of the anthropic principle, because we'll think about a bit about tomorrow afternoon, very impressed by the emergence of persons in the course of cosmic history. I think myself, I think Paul will agree with me, that if you look at the 13.7 billion year history of the cosmos and ask the question, what is the most astonishing thing that's happened in the course of that history, of which we are aware anyway, I think I would say the appearance of persons here on Earth, of self-conscious beings, able to be aware of themselves and to understand themselves, able to look into the future, and able, in fact, to be scientists. Through the coming to be of persons, either in us or our hominid ancestors, the universe became aware of itself from within itself, which I think is the most astonishing development. And as I say, a byproduct of that was the possibility of science, which of course has given us an amazing degree of understanding about the world. So all these things suggest that something is going on in cosmic history, which goes beyond the value-free, officially value-free descriptions, eschewing notions of purpose and so on, which is science's account simply on its own. Cosmic religiosity is a pretty common view in my experience among scientists. I suppose one of the greatest examples of that was Albert Einstein. I mean, he often liked to talk about God, referring to him rather familiar terms as the old one, like, oh, that's a customary circumlocution in German. And he would say things like, when making his great discoveries, he felt like a child in the presence of the elders. There is the mystery of the universe, which is its comprehensibility. There is the beautiful order of the world. And Einstein would acknowledge that, but he also went on to say that he himself saw no sign of sort of personal God that the Abrahamic faiths we wish to talk about. And of course that's obviously because he's simply looking at the impersonal discoveries of science, impressive and powerful and pointing beyond themselves, as I think they are. But if you're going to discover a personal God, a God who takes an interest in individuals, then you're going to have to take the risk and ambiguity of looking not at impersonal encounter with reality, but at personal experience and unique personal experience. You have to move into a different realm of encounter. And Einstein once said that he went into science as a flight from the personal to the impersonal. It's not very to be in personal relations in various ways. And so there is a certain aridity, really, about that point of view. So that's one possibility. It's the God who is the great mathematician or the cosmic architect, the God whose mind and will lies behind the order and fruitfulness of the world, but a God who may have no particular concern with what's happening. That picture of God is consistent with a deistic spectator who just sets the world going and then stands back to let it all happen, as it is for the God who is more involved in the unfolding history of creation. It seems to me that that approach to the science and theology dialogue illustrates, in a sense, to me anyway, illustrates the theological thinness that will result simply from arguments of a kind of natural theology. Now, the second form of interaction and certain part content is something that that I chose to label theistic. And my exemplary figure for that is in fact Ian Barber himself. Ian writes very clearly within a Christian context. I mean, you couldn't read his writing without recognizing that that's where he comes from. He is prepared to take into account, therefore, much more in the way of motivating experience and evidence than, say, somebody like Davis is prepared to address. So, quite frequently in his writing, for example, refers to the cross of Jesus Christ as a sign of the power of suffering love. On the other hand, I think he's quite cautious and in many ways reserved about other aspects which seem to me to be central to Christian belief. You take the Nicene Creed, for example, which is the sort of theological data table, concise account that pretty universally recognized in the Christian world, both East and West, in relation to Christian belief. You'll find that there are quite a number of articles of the Creed that Ian really doesn't engage with very much. I don't know what he does personally, but we've, of course, many times talked to each other. So in his writings, for example, you'll find very, very little discussion of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which to me is absolutely central to my own Christian belief. I'm not going to argue that point in detail now, that's something I quite like doing. So there is this approach is much more theologically rich than a theistic point of view. It has a picture of God who in some sense interacts with history, is certainly concerned with individuals, and so on. But there is a degree, nevertheless, it seems to me, of reserve and of consequent unnecessarily theological modesty about the concepts that it is prepared to draw into account. So far, that's better than theism, in my view, but not good enough, in my view as well. So I move on to a third category, which I've labelled revisionary. Now my example is my dear late friend and colleague, Arthur Peacock. Arthur is very much engaged with theological issues. I recently reread the autobiographical chapter he wrote in one of his books, and he says, for example, that people like Origen and Augustine and Aquinas have been very important to him in his thinking. So he's a person who takes the Christian tradition very seriously in that respect. There's quite a lot in Arthur's writing about the resurrection, that's for sure. There's quite a lot about how to interpret the New Testament evidence of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and so on. So there's a very considerable increase in theological thickness in moving, it seems to me anyway, from Barber to Peacock. Nevertheless, in the last few years of his life, Arthur somehow began to feel that there were serious flaws in traditional Christian thinking, and that he therefore called for I'm hesitating, but I'm not trying to say this correctly. He therefore adopted a quite strongly revisionary rhetoric in quite a lot of what he wrote in the last few years of his life, saying that essentially upbraiding theology for not taking science sufficiently seriously. Well, I would agree with him about that, but implying that if it were done, then there would be really quite substantial changes in theological thinking. I think it's fair to say that he didn't work that out fully. He didn't have the time perhaps to work that out fully. But there is that sort of challenging revisionary tone. He wrote one of his books has is it 12 or 14 points that he thinks theology has to address. Some of them are things that everybody would agree that contemporary theology thinking has to engage with. Evolution of biology, for example, and of course Arthur was extremely helpful in thinking about the implications of that. The possibility of extraterrestrial life, well, I agree that's an interesting speculative topic and so on. But other things, and in particular, it seems to me that he was, though he wanted to, certainly to speak positively of belief in the resurrection, he was also very wary about the whole issue of miracle. And obviously there's a tension here between those two, because if a man comes alive again to live a life of unending glory, and whatever form that life might take, something has happened which has been without precedent in the history of the world. Arthur likes sometimes to use the sort of evolutionary language, and also Ian Barber uses, to see Jesus as a new emergence. As representing, if you like, the prototype of some development in human nature which had not happened before, but which could happen again. I think there was an unresolved tension between Arthur's more conservative, patristic way of thinking about these things and his contemporary thing. But certainly there was a call for a vision in a way that I didn't feel drawn to accept. And so that's an area where perhaps other people wish to follow and develop not. But I prefer the fourth category, which I've called developmental. And I choose myself as the exemplar of that, so we have to allow for that and what I have to say about it. I'm not going to say I think that's a ridiculous one you take, obviously it's the one that I set myself. And the developmental view, I think, recognises that theological thinking is influenced by changing understanding, is influenced by the stages of intellectual history. We've already said that clearly we think about the doctrine of creation today in a different way from the way in which people, say, 300 years ago were thought about. So there, of course, every generation of Christian thinkers, I'm speaking entirely in terms of Christian belief when I say this, but I'm sure that Jewish and Islamic belief have similar phases. Every generation has to take the core of the faith, for example, articulated in those very brief words, there are only about 120 of them in the Nicene Creed, and interpret them in its own way and according to its own understanding. So each generation will have particular resources coming from other forms of human understanding, including, of course, from science, which will modify and enrich that form of understanding. But I think that process, it isn't the question that here's the faith, once delivered to the saints, quite unalterable in its character, and all you have to do is to sign up to what people said in 381 or 451, which was the councils of Constantinople and Chalcedon. We have to be Christians of our own time. But I want to say two things about that. One is that I believe that we can do so in some form of developing but continuous relationship with the understandings of the past. I don't think that there are key Christian insights that have only become available for people who happen to be living at the beginning of the 21st century. There are, of course, insights that are available to us, but not been available to other people. But I don't think that the change is quite as drastic, quite as originally, as for example, Arthur seemed to think. Moreover, I believe that each generation of religious believers has to live, not simply in the present. Of course, we can't be anything other than 21st century Christians, that's what we are, but also has to live in a living dialogue and living relationship with the generations of the past. Science is a cumulative subject. We really do it has a linear, crudely speaking, I know there are ups and downs, starts and stops, but crudely speaking, science has a linear, progressive attitude to it. I'm just an ordinary 21st century physicist, but I know a great deal more about the universe than Isaac Newton ever knew. Not because I'm cleverer than I think, but because I lived 300 years later than he did. And though I immensely respect Newton, of course, I don't have to read the Principia. The lasting, valuable insights of Newton into mechanics and the nature of gravity and so on, they are incorporated uncontroversially into contemporary textbook knowledge. So science, in that sense, is a synchronic subject, as the theologians like to say. It lives largely in the present, not unaware of the past, not ungrateful for the great insightful thinkers of the past, but essentially living on its current resources. But theology, a religious understanding, can't operate in that fashion, because theology is not an unproblematically cumulative subject in the way that it seems to me that science is. There is no presumed superiority in a 21st century theologian over the theologians of the 16th century or the 4th century, in a way that there would be for scientists. And that means that we have to be in continual dialogue with the past. We need to make sure that we do not lose the insights of the past. It's entirely possible, and indeed I think it's the case, that, say, the English mystics of the 14th century, people like Julian of Norwich, Walter Hilton, and people like that, the unknown author of The Cloud of Unknown, had insights into the divine nature and human contact with the divine nature that we may be in danger of losing unless we apprentice ourselves to their insights. Augustine and Aquinas and the Cappadocian Fathers and the Reformers and so on are living, continuing participants in the theological dialogue in a way that Newton and Maxwell and Darwin, great scientists that they were, are not living, continuing participants in the scientific dialogue. Theology, as the theologians like to say, is a diachronic subject. It's inevitably stretches over the century and has to have that dialogue with the past. Not in thrall of the past, but equally not scorning or being lacking consideration for the insights of the past. That's how it seems to me. And when I wrote my own Gifford lectures, which I made the terrible mistake of allowing to be published under two different titles on different sides of the Atlantic, called Science and Christian Belief in this country, and Faith of Physicists, actually is a better title, I didn't choose it, in North America. I tried, 9 of my 10 chapters, 9 of my 10 lectures, are devoted to looking at items in the Nicene Creed, and trying to present motivations for belief in the truth represented by those items in a bottom-up thinking way, a way that seeks to move from experience to interpretation. That's one of the big contrasts and one of the big difficulties in some ways between scientific thinking and theological thinking, and which certainly has an influence on the dialogue between the two. Scientists, it seems to me, are instinctively bottom-up thinking. The question that we ask about things is not, is that reasonable? As if we knew beforehand the shape that rationality has to take. I mean, nobody in 1899 could have thought that quantum theory was reasonable. That something could sometimes behave like a wave, and sometimes like a particle, like a flappy, spread out thing, and like a little bullet. I mean, it was manifestly unreasonable. Any first-year philosophy student could have approved the impossibility of that combination. But in fact, that's the way the world works. And actually, now, of course, we understand why the world works that way. But that's not my story this morning. The world is too surprising. We found the physical world, biological world, to be too surprising to have confidence in our powers of rational prevision. So we don't ask the question, is it reasonable? But we do ask a different question. What makes you think that might be the case? You see, that's in one sense, one way, it's a more open question. It doesn't lay down beforehand the expected form of the answer. But it's not a more exacting question. And it's not going to accept an answer unless there is motivating evidence for it. That's what I call bottom-up thinking, the attempt to move from experience, our own or others' assessed experience, to understanding. A lot of
people who work in theology, particularly if they come from a philosophical background, as many people do, particularly continental theologians, are instinctive top-down thinkers. They start not in the basement of experience and move up to the first floor of understanding. They start in the 10th floor of clear and certain ideas, general, unquestionable general principles, and seek to descend to the first floor to consideration in particular. Well, there's certainly scope for that sort of thinking, but it's dangerous thinking and has to be exercised with caution, because what seem to be clear and certain ideas, what seem to be undeniable general principles, have so often proved out not to be the case. And I have the same subtitle, my favorite lectures on both sides of the Atlantic, was the theological reflections of bottom-up thinking. That's the way I want to try and approach the dialogue between the two. So there we are. I think I've probably talked for long enough, not quite an hour, but long enough. And the most interesting bit anyway is the conversation, which I look forward to having. There is clearly a vigorous dialogue taking place between science and religion. It's very unfortunate that most of that dialogue is not reflected in the public media, so that people who just read newspaper articles or watch television will be unaware of much of what's going on. That's sort of sad, but I suppose we all have a little bit to try and do to try and remedy that a little bit. It's a fascinating dialogue. It's an essential dialogue. I'm a very, very convinced believer in the unity of knowledge. I'm very, very against any form of compartmentalism. I certainly don't want to be a priest on Sundays and a physicist on Mondays. I want to be both on both days, hold the two together. I can't do that, of course, without puzzles, obviously. But I do think I can do it with reason and integrity. And that's the basis, the true basis for the dialogue between science and religion. That's what I think, and now you can tell me.
Well, thank you very much, John. That leaves plenty of time for questions. I'm going to take Chairman's privilege while you think up questions, just to pursue one last idea on your top-down and bottom-up.
Yep.
And can I put it to you that theologians are of necessity top-down thinkers, because the only way we can know God's purposes is if he tells us, and he claims to do so through Scripture and through Jesus. So in that respect, the theologians have to be top-down if they're talking about God's purposes and their interaction with this world.
Well, I certainly believe, of course, that one of the big differences between science and religion, which I might have mentioned, was that in science, the investigative initiative largely lies with the scientist. If you're an evolutionary biologist or if you're a physical cosmologist, you have a more passive role. You have to take what evidence comes to you about those historical subjects. But if you work in an experimental subject, you decide what experiments to do. So the initiative, you can, in some sense, force nature, to use Baconian language, force nature to disclose some of its secrets. But in the sphere of religion and theological reflection upon religion, the initiative doesn't simply lie with the inquiry. The initiative also lies, and principally lies, as you said, with God, who acts in acts of divine disclosure. And that's why revelation, this is another stumbling block for some of our scientific friends, why revelation is really an indispensable word, at least in relation to, say, the Abrahamic faiths. But revelation, when properly understood, is not, in my view, the ineffable communication of unquestionable propositional truth. It is the account, and it will necessarily be the human account of particular revelationary acts of divine disclosure. God acts within history, I think, to make God's nature known. And of course, like you, I believe that God is particularly active in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But that's conveyed to us in a very substantial and significant way by the record of the historical record of those uniquely revelatory events. That's what gives it, in my view, that's what gives Scripture its importance. Not that it's a divinely guaranteed text written in heaven, which is not how Christian theology is properly thought about Scripture, but it's just a record of these revelations. That's why, for example, my own thinking, I spend a lot of time reading New Testament theology as far as I can. I'm not an expert in it, but I try to read as much as I can. And I quite often write about the historical Jesus in one way or another in books that I write. When I went to theological college, as a middle-aged student, professor having become a student again, which was an interesting experience in itself, when I went to theological college, the courses I most enjoyed were the biblical studies courses. Because as a scientist, my instinct was to say, what's the experience, what's the motivating experience that raises the question you were trying to discuss? So I preferred biblical theology in that sense to systematic theology. And of course, you need both, and so on. So I agree, of course, that in that sense that there's top down because God acts to make things known, but it's humanly conveyed and not inevitably conveyed. And moreover, what we understand from these revelationary disclosures has to bear some consonant relationship with the no doubt much more humdrum kinds of religious experience we have in our own lives. If there wasn't some sort of sync between the two, then they wouldn't make much sense. So, of course, when I talk about top-down thinking in theology, I'm thinking of things like. Sorry, it's a long reply, but it's an important question. I think about things like long chapters in great works of systematic theology, big section called Deo Uno, which is all about the nature of God, and talked about in very metaphysical, philosophical terms, the necessary simplicity of God, and so on and so on. Well, I think that's right. I don't, as I say, there is of course obviously a role for that type of thinking, but I think it's dangerous if it takes too dominant a role without response to the base of it. Right, that's fair.
I would like to ask 2 questions.
Yeah.
Number 1. Your
Speak
book,
up a bit, I'm a bit
Would you like just to come forward and then we can hear
your
a bit
book,
better?
Clark's Chaos in Christianity,
Yeah.
which you quoted here mostly. You say that even God doesn't know the future of His creation, as this future doesn't exist yet. Can you give more explanation to this thesis, which is quite uncomfortable for the Orthodox theology?
Could you just repeat?
And
Yes,
in this perspective, in which manner we have to understand Jesus saying
No,
in the gospel
oh,
that the day of the world or the end is known only by my Father.
okay, yeah, I'm asked about, in Clark's case of Christianity, and quite often in my writing, I take a view of God's relationship to time, which to me seems to carry the implication that God does not yet know the unformed future. And of course, if I'm right in describing the future as unformed and therefore not yet existing, that would be no divine imperfection. Because if God knows all that can be known, but if the future is not there to be known, even God can't know. Now that is undoubtedly a very contentious thing to say, and it undoubtedly goes against a good many centuries of theological thinking. I've been talking about the necessity of dialogue across the centuries, so I need to take that point seriously. Classical theology, which in the West I suppose we think of as Augustine, Aquinas, on through people like Calvin, took a view of God's relationship to time, which was that God is wholly outside time, totally unconnected with time, looking down upon the whole of history laid out before the atemporal divine gaze. God did not foreknow any future events. God simply knew. God knows what I'm going to do tomorrow as unproblematically as God knows what I'm doing today, because all events on this view are contemporaneous to God. So there was no conflict, and it was very carefully worked out all this. There was no conflict between divine knowledge and human freedom. But God had this totally atemporal view. Now many of us think that classical theology, powerful and undoubtedly important though it was, tended to take a little bit too distant a view of God's relationship to creation. It's too detached from it. For example, Aquinas said that God acts on creatures, but creatures don't act upon God, which is sort of a funny thing to say about the God of love, I think. So there's been a movement in contemporary theology, I suppose in 20th century theology really, to envisage a different relationship to God. And it's been connected also, I think, with scientific development. We've become, I think, this is a big issue which I don't have time to argue. It seems to me that 20th century physics first destroyed a merely mechanical view of the nature of the world and gave, through the intrinsic unpredictability of quantum theory and chaos theory, a picture much more of a world of unfolding development, in which the future is not an implication of the past in the way that, say, Laplace thought, but there are causal principles like human agency and divine providence which bring about the future in ways that make it unpredictable in that sense, in an intrinsic sense. And if that's the case, and that's the nature of creation, then it is surely a theological axiom that God knows things according to their real natures. And if the nature of the world is not an atemporal space-time continuum, but an unfolding process of development, then God will know that created world in accordance with its nature. And that, I think, means that God not simply knows that events in history are successive, but God knows them in their succession. It's contentious, and I'm sure there'll be lots of you who won't agree with me, and I think it's an important conversation and discussion to continue. If that's the case, then you have a picture of a God who, of course there is an eternal aspect of God. I mean, God is not enthralled to time the way that you and I are. God did not come into being with the Big Bang. There is an eternal, atemporal aspect of the faithful God. But when God, in my view, when God brought into being a temporal world, then God condescended to engage with the temporality of that creation. In other words, I take a dipolar view of God, though there is both an eternal aspect of God and also a temporal, historical aspect of God. Process theologians have been very keen on this, but they think that's imposed upon God. That metaphysically God didn't have any choice about being involved with history. I think that God chose to know a temporal creation in a temporal way. And that was very much the way in which God is portrayed in the Bible. God, particularly in the Old Testament, which is very anthropomorphic, of course, in this language, but it portrays God continually interacting with the history of Israel and indeed changing the divine mind. Hezekiah, you're going to die. Don't want to die. Okay, 15 more years. I mean, of course that's anthropomorphic, but I think there's a serious point behind it. And if that's the case, and if that picture is correct, there's a movement called open theology, which essentially pursues this. Then I think that, as I say, because the future isn't there to be known, and God is engaged with time that way, even God is not yet the future. Now, of course, God, wait a minute, I'm quite finished. Of course, but God understands what's happening in history in a way that you and I obviously don't. So in that sense, God is not enthralled to history. So there is a role for prophecy, for example. When Nebuchadnezzar besieges Jerusalem, God sees that Pharaoh isn't going to come from Egypt and rescue them. He sends Jeremiah to say to the king of Israel, you need to make peace with the Babylonians the best terms you can, which of course they don't agree to do. I don't think that God saw beforehand which particular Babylonian soldier first took the torch to burn down Solomon's temple, but God saw the motions of history. And moreover, God is at work, I think, to bring about God's purposes in history. So when Jesus speaks about the Father knowing the end, I think that's a statement not of God has this timetable up the divine sleeve, but that God's purposes will be fulfilled in the unfolding of history. That God will bring about determinate consequences, even if they have to be by contingent end. By contingent parts. So that's what I think about it. But as I say, there's quite a lot of weight of theological opinion against it, but that's my
I think that God has an undeterminist view of his creation. You think that God has an undeterminist view on his creation, or it acts mostly like a strange attractor?
I think that theological thinking has to steer a course between two extreme and unacceptable pictures of God's relationship to creation. One is the theistic spectator, just letting it all happen, seeing what happens. The other is the cosmic tyrant, the puppet master of the universe who pulls every string, makes everything happen willy-nilly. That can't be the God of love either, it seems to me. I think that God allows creatures to be themselves and to make themselves. That's not imposed upon God, that's what the process theologians say, but it's God's free choice, loving choice, we want to say, to do that. And then God therefore has this more flexible relationship. That's what we want.
Yeah, any other
We could
questions?
spend all day talking about this. But thank you very much for raising this very important issue.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is not so much a question. I just simply want to rephrase what you just said to see if I understood it correctly.
Okay.
It's towards the end of your
Sure.
talk.
Yes. Okay.
Somehow the point was that science or science experiment, and therefore if something doesn't stand up to experiment, it's thrown out, and therefore what we have, it has gone through this process of falsification or not, and therefore we don't need to be in dialogue with the past. A scientist in the incorporates Newton, and in fact has actually corrected Newton,
Right.
and therefore I don't need to really.
On the other hand, if you want to send an explorer satellite to Mars, you better do the calculations Newtonianly rather than through general relativity.
Right. However, when experiences which are irreducible,
Right.
and therefore they cannot be repeated in any sense, and so in dialogue with the past to take into account those irreducible experiences, because the experience in theology that I must have now with extra knowledge that I've acquired through science, for instance, is based upon this total sum of irreducible experiences. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that would be more or less what I'm trying to say. Let me say first of all that I don't take too simplistic a view of the success of science. I don't think it just goes from inevitable triumph to inevitable triumph, otherwise John would pop up and put me right very quickly. But I do think science does conquer territory, but it isn't going to have to lose. I mean, atoms have come to stay. The helical structure of DNA is not going to be revised. There may be lots of other things you need to learn about genetics and proteomics and all that sort of stuff, but you know, there are things that do seem to be gains that are not going to be changed. And all forms of human knowledge that encompass the personal, all forms of human experience that encompass the personal, don't have quite that unshakable character to them. And certainly don't have that progressive character. I mean, there is no reason to think that 21st century music is superior to the music of the 18th century. In fact, I would rather the converse thesis. So in all these sort of areas, you know, the richness of reality is such that we have to make sure we don't lose any resources that we have for participating in it and for understanding it. So thank you very much. I think we phrased that very thoughtfully. Should we go back there and come forward?
Do you think there are
We
areas?
stand up. I think people hear you better. I should sit here better.
Do you think there are areas such as resurrection from the dead, or the ideas about heaven, or even healing, that are beyond the realms of scientific inquiry, or do you think they could be, even should be considered to be within the ambit of science, or they just no-go areas?
Well, thanks very much. Yes, sort of advertisement. I've written a book called The God of Hope and the End of the World, which tries to address some of these issues. It seems to me that every story that science tells necessarily ends in death and futility. Essentially, the second law of thermodynamics is going to make sure that happens. Whether it's human life, we're all going to die. Whether it's the universe itself, which is over a very, very long time scale, is going to end in some sort of futility, most probably a futility of cold and dilution. So science tells a horizontal story, the conclusion of which is that all ends in futility. And that's why, like Steven Weinberg, very famous Nobel Prize winning, there's actually a friend of mine, as it happens, one of these atheists who loves talking about God, which I always think is a good sign, says notoriously at the end of the first few minutes, the more he understands the universe, the more it seems pointless to him. And I think if that's the only story you can tell, that's a pretty understandable judgment. But of course, I believe that there is a political story, actually, which is the story of God's faithfulness, which includes, which I believe has been manifested and in some sense guaranteed by the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And that story suggests that although life in this world ends in futility, there is a hope of a destiny beyond death, but only, not a hope that science could either speak for or against, but because it is a hope that depends upon trust in the divine faithfulness. So I think there are lots of issues that science can't arbitrate on because of its self-limitation, its versus its success, by the modesty of its ambition. I think the question of a destiny beyond death, you then have to ask the question, does it make sense to think of a destiny beyond death? What's the carrier of continuity between this world and the next world? Lots of questions like that, which are very interesting to discuss, which I obviously can't discuss now, but this book at a very modest price will tell you what I think about it. But I think there are lots of things outside science today.
Good. I think we had a couple of bookshelf first.
Yeah, thank you very much for your.
Can you stand up?
Okay.
Stand up. Yeah.
Thank you for your models of interrelating faith and science, which I appreciated. But I always heard about like a sort of one-way influence. I mean, I saw lots of examples or hints of how scientific thinking can and should influence theology, and enriches our theological thinking maybe. But are there also influences the other way around? Are there examples where science could or should be influenced by theological thoughts, apart from the interpretational level?
Yeah. Well, that's very. Thank you for asking that question. It's a very, very important question. But there are a variety of ways in which that might be so, and there are some people who think, Stanley Yaki would be perhaps one of the most assertive maintainers of this position, that it was a theology of creation that helps to get modern science going in the first place. Because if God is the creator, the world will have an order to it. Because God is free, you have to look and see what order God has chosen. And this leads you to experimental science with mathematical order behind it. I mean, Yaki undoubtedly very greatly overstates the case, but I mean, John would know much more about it than I do, but there is some degree of at least consonant influence in that respect. That's a rather special situation. There are lots of questions that arise from science which go beyond science, of which questions of causality and the nature of time are examples. Science can tell us, for example, that in the quantum theory there is intrinsic unpredictability, probabilistic theory. But it doesn't tell us whether that probabilistic character arises from determinate influences which are not known to us, hidden variables as people say in the trade, or whether it represents an intrinsic openness in physical process. And it turns out that you can interpret quantum theory either way. The conventional interpretation, which goes back to Niels Bohr and so on, which most physicists subscribe to, and which I myself subscribe to, is that Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is a true principle of indeterminacy. There's an ontological openness, if you like, in that respect. But that very clever, wayward man, in one way, David Bohm, in the 1950s, showed that you could find an equally empirically adequate theory, where there were, in fact, which was totally deterministic and was unproblematically Newtonian in one sense, as you might wish it to be, but which the uncertainties arose from ignorance. So for Bohm, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is simply a principle of epistemological ignorance. Now, that shows us that science, empirical science, cannot settle the question of the nature of causality in the quantum world. That requires a metaphysical decision. Many of us think that quantum theory is clever, but too clever by half. It has an air of contrivance about it. We don't like that. It's one of the reasons. There are lots of other reasons why we don't go for it. But that's a metaphysical argument, certainly going beyond science. So there are lots of metaphysical questions which science can't answer. And when you get into that realm, it's perfectly reasonable for metaphysical arguments of all sorts to play their role. It's perfectly legitimate, for example, for theology to come along and say, well, I would prefer a world that was open this causal character rather than deterministic. I mean, that's a possible input into the argument. So there are undoubtedly questions that, as I say, I don't think theology can determine the strictly scientific answer to strictly scientific questions. But there are only a limited range of questions. The nature of causality, the nature of temporality is another issue, certainly, which is not decided simply by science alone. So there are lots of things that take you beyond where theology has a role to play. But that's the form of the influence. It might encourage scientists. There's another encouragement I think that 17th century scientists had was that if the world is God's creation, it's worth trying to understand it. It's worth the effort of doing science. There may be encouragement of that sort. There are metaphysical issues that quickly take you beyond what science on its own can answer. The form of influence is different between the two in that respect, but not totally different. It's a very fair question to ask. Is that what I'm saying?
I think there's a question here, then we're going to the back.
Thank you. I think you partly answered this or responded to it, but you used the word motivated belief,
Right.
motivated thinking.
Right.
Do I take it from that, say, in science, that there is some sense that there is a profoundly kind of motivated reason for there being science, that we have a natural desire to know about the world, and that we seek knowledge from some sort of inner quality that we have as human beings? And are you, in that case, thinking that our desire to know about God comes from the same source, that we have a natural desire to know about God? Is that what you mean by motivated, or is there something else?
It's clear to I certainly think that there is a very deep human desire to search for understanding. I think that certainly motivates science. Those of us who work in pure science, that's what really motivates us. Not so we can get patents and earn lots of money, but to understand the world a little bit better. There are some people who think that, I suppose, Patrick Boyer would be one, that the original arose simply as an attempt to provide understanding where understanding couldn't be had, and it was just a response to this thing. I think that's wrong, but I do think it's natural to try and understand the world as much as possible. And when I talk about motivated belief, I mean that understanding is not just plucked out of the air in some arbitrary fashion. It gives you a synthesized comprehension and a degree of understanding what's going on, which is intellectually satisfying. I think theology plays that role. I often say, for example, that I don't think atheists are stupid, of course, but I do think that atheism explains less than theism does. I think there are some things like the deep intelligibility of the world, the rational beauty of the world that physicists particularly are concerned about, which have to be treated by the atheists as just happy accidents or brute facts, which seem to me to point beyond themselves and call for some form of explanation. In that sense, I think religion does offer, and that's a very cosmic sort of religion in this case, of course, offers a more comprehensive understanding.
Thank you. There's a question right at the back.
You mentioned already a list of differences between a lot of things. For example, if we use words for reality, but words are limited. We cannot express everything with words. At the same time, we have feelings, but feelings are not properly for language. We can express a part of what we feel or something. So there is a difference between language and what we experience, what we feeling, what we feel have in relation with the reality. There is another difference between theories and reality. So the theories is not identical with realities, and part of realities are not in the theories and the same. All these differences are barriers or facilitate the dialogue between religion and science. This is first question.
Let me deal with that first, otherwise I'll forget it. Well, I think that I acknowledge the differences. And actually language is an extraordinarily subtle thing. And one of the difficulties that sometimes scientists have, they're used to very precise languages. the language of mathematics, particularly if you happen to be a physical scientist, which is a pretty precise form of language. But most language operates with a sort of penumbra meaning around it. That's why poetry is possible. It has an elusive character, why metaphors are powerful and so on. And that's the sort of language, as you rightly say, which we struggle to use to convey feelings, and including religious feelings, and encounter with the reality of God. We need to take that into account. And of course, I gladly acknowledge that all our knowledge is always limited. Theories, as you say, theories are maps. They're not the terrain. But we have to do the best we can. And the amazing thing is, it seems to me, which we just take for granted most times, is that we are very, very successful at doing this. In science, I think in theology, and in many other forms of human investigation of the nature of reality, we're able to attain a degree of understanding and intellectual satisfaction to a quite astonishing degree. The world is not so opaque to us as some might have expected it to be.
And the second question is that is that a way to experience reality and to have experience in religion and science, a way to use this kind of limits of instruments limited? Because all the instruments to investigate reality are limited in this way. Language, concepts, experiences, theories has limits. Can we choose this way to have experience, religious experience, for example, for scientists, and scientific experience, if we say, for religious people, to make a deep interaction between religion and science? Because it's not the questions about language or methods, you told us. Maybe it's a question about experiences. No?
Well, I don't think it's one of these big questions, isn't it, about the relationship between things like language and experience. I mean, can you think without thinking in words? Is a very one of the classical problems about that. I mean, I think. You asked a very deep question. I think that we live in a reality which is immensely rich and many leveled. And we need to try and view that reality from as many different perspectives as possible to do stereoscopic justice, if you like, to its richness. And I think that science is one perspective, and religious belief and understanding is another perspective, and there are lots of things in between, like our ethical understandings, our aesthetic experience, and so on, which have to be drawn in. And the great thing, the one thing I think we really have to resist, we all have a great temptation to gain understanding, as we think of it, through oversimplification. A Procrustean technique of chopping off the bits that don't fit into our favourite account. And that's the one thing I think that it's disastrous to do. That means that we have to live with quite a lot of puzzle. How this perspective and that perspective relates to each other. They won't be transparent. Thank
you. Is there a theological method, and has the method arrived at any enduring truths that we can hold on to?
Well, you could ask the same question about science, I think. I mean, it's one of the debating points. I mean, the scientific method is something much more subtle than most 20th century accounts of it succeeded in encapsulating. I mean, I think the philosopher of science who I find the most helpful in thinking about science is Michael Polanyi, who was himself, of course, a very distinguished physical chemist before he became a philosopher, and knew science from the inside. And his principal book is a book called Personal Knowledge, and the thesis of that book is that though science is studying impersonal aspects of the world, that study is intrinsically an activity of persons. It involves tacit skills of judgment and so on, which can only be learned through apprenticeship within a truth-seeking community, which can't be reduced to a black book protocol of method, or delegated to a computer to work it out. And in the preface of that book, he says, I'm writing this book, he's talking about science, remember, I'm writing this book to show how I may commit myself to what I believe to be true. Commitment is very important for that. I may commit myself to what I believe to be true, knowing that it might be false. And I think that is the human condition. We don't attain the certainty of knowledge in any form, any field. And if that's true of science, it's certainly, in a sense, true of religion. That's why we say we walk by faith rather than by sight. I don't think it's possible to boil down the scientific method in a sort of specified protocol, and even less so, of course, the theological method. People do write lots of books about method and theology. Something I found particularly helpful in that direction is Jesuit, Canadian Jesuit theologian Bernard Lonergan wrote a book called Theological Method, or Where's That Effect? He's very much, of course, in the Thomistic tradition, as Jesuits tend to be, and that's the tradition, very much of faith-seeking understanding and of motivated belief. One of my favourite Lonergan quotes, which I must slip in here, is that he wrote a very difficult book called Insight, which isn't the book to begin with Lonergan. But towards the end of it, he says, God is the all-sufficient explanation, the eternal rapture glimpsed in every Archimedean cry of Eureka. And I just love that. It speaks to the physicist and the priest in me. No, there are things like that, but I mean, all human intellectual inquiry of a truth-seeking kind is a very subtle form of activity. But the amazing thing is it seems to be a pretty successful one.
But you would think that a lot of what goes on in science, as you say, is a very personal inquiry. This is the process of arriving at a hypothesis. It's almost revelatory or inspirational sometimes to arrive at a scientific hypothesis. And you say that science is answering how. Now, is there anything equivalent for why? Can we not arrive at a hypothesis as to why you put the kettle on? And can we not test it, perhaps?
Well, testing is I think a concept in any sort of exacting, you can't really quarrel with this sense, is actually a pretty difficult concept even within science. You know, somebody discovers a new planet, Uranus, doesn't seem to be following Newton's predictions. So what do? They say, poor old Isaac, he's copped it at last. No, they think about it and they produce this very ingenious hypothesis. There's another planet they happen to discover, which later called Neptune, beyond which is silly. So, I mean, how do you test
The
things?
anomalies pile up and you have to have
Yes,
a
well,
revision.
like Clark-Torsion was the philosopher of science who discussed this a lot. I mean, it's quite subtle in science, and it's obviously much more subtle in theology. So I'm just saying, you know, I really, I mean, it's part of this sort of simplistic notion that's out there, I'm sure not in here, that sees science as absolutely unproblematic, truth-generating machine, you turn the handle and out comes things. I mean, it's much more subtle than that, and therefore it's not so much different from theology. Though obviously it's different. I'm not saying that they're the same thing.
I think that's a very good note on which to stop. We've been feeding our minds all morning, so it's time to feed our stomachs for lunch. Before we do that, let's thank Sir John again very much.